for April 4th. So, our very first item on the agenda, which makes me very happy as a chemist, is by Rebecca Esselman, who's going to tell us about PAH contamination. For those of you who don't know what PAHs are, they aren't PhDs that didn't quite make it. That stands for polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. Well, one of the most familiar versions of those are the nasty things that show up in, for example, cigarette smoke and give people lung cancer. So that's the category of molecules that turn out to be of concern in the contamination that Rebecca is going to tell us about. So welcome, Rebecca, and please introduce yourself and your background first, and then tell us the story. This is, of course, part of our Green Themes series.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me up tonight. I'm Rebecca Esselman. I'm a watershed planner with the Huron River Watershed Council. And for those of you who might not be familiar, the headwaters of the Huron are just a little bit south of here. We're an organization that focuses on water resource protection, primarily of the Huron River, but we regularly engage on issues with broader implications for water resource protection at the state and regional level, and these pavement sealants have been one of those issues that we have stepped outside of our watershed boundaries and have been talking with groups such as yourself to raise awareness about it and talk about what we can do. So this issue came across our desk not that long ago. In 2014, we were contacted by Freshwater Future, which is a Great Lakes regional group focused on freshwater, and they were trying to raise awareness about pavement sealants and the toxics that they contain in the Great Lakes region, kind of on the heels of Minnesota passing a statewide ban on coal tar sealants. And after doing some due diligence and taking a look at the issue ourselves, we decided to pick it up in earnest. And ever since then, we've been talking to groups like yours, talking to residents, talking to legislators, and really trying to get some traction in the state of Michigan on the pavement sealant issue. So I shared with you guys a couple of documents ahead of today's meeting. That USGS fact sheet to me is one of the best summaries of the science out there on pavement sealers and PAH contamination. And so I will go over that content a little bit, but not a lot, assuming that you all have done that reading. But for anyone watching at home, I'll give an overview of it. And then we can have a discussion where you guys can, ask any questions that came up as you were reviewing the content. I also shared a model ordinance that we share with communities that we talk to about this. And I'll also talk with you about what actions have taken place in Michigan already. And a number of communities have adopted ordinances to prohibit the use of high PAH pavement sealants in their municipalities. So we'll get to that too. But to back up a little bit, what are pavement sealants for those that don't know? Because prior to 2014, I didn't really know. I mean, I did know. I remember, everybody's driven down a 2-lane road and seen a sign in a front yard and a freshly glazed over asphalt driveway that looks shiny black and new. But I hadn't thought too much about what that stuff was and where it might go once it leaves the driveway. So it's that black liquid that's sprayed on low traffic asphalt surfaces. It's marketed as a beautifying product and something that increases the longevity of your asphalt surface. And most seal coats that are available now are either coal tar based or asphalt based. Of course, in recent years now, there's been some alternative based products coming to market as well, in part as a response to some backlash against the coal tar sealants. And this has made the issue a little bit more complicated because those sealant bases can also be very high in PAHs, which are the contaminants of concern, but they're not coal tar. So some of the earliest entities that regulated pavement sealants said coal tar no, anything else is fine. that's no longer sufficient because some of the alternatives are now also, they still remain high in PAHs, which is what we're concerned about. This stuff is applied on low traffic asphalt surfaces, so it's driveways, it's parking lots, it's trails, sometimes it's schoolyards, think airports, strip malls, your bank, all of those types of surfaces are pretty regularly seal coated as a maintenance practice. I don't know if I mentioned this, but the industry recommends sealing every 2 to 3 years, which means that in those 2 to 3 years, this stuff weathers off and needs to be reapplied. And it doesn't just go away, of course. It has to go somewhere, and that's sort of where the problem begins. Seal coats are not used on heavy traffic roads, so that's not where the issue comes into play. It's also an east of the Rockies issue. Coal tar is a byproduct of the steel industry, which we have in spades here, but shipping across the Rockies becomes less economically viable, so they are primarily using the asphalt-based on the West Coast, but those of us east of the Rockies, primarily the seal coating that's done has historically been this coal tar-based seal coat. We're talking to the tune of 85 million gallons per year of coal tar seal coat are sold in the U.S. Like I said, if you pay attention, every spring you see this happening on every third driveway or so and parking lots. So it's very ubiquitous practice, and a lot of areas covered with this stuff every year. When we started reaching out to area applicators, when we were learning more about the issue, all but one was applying coal tar. So it is the seal coat of choice among the applicators. And, if you see seal coating done, most likely what you're seeing is that high pH seal coat. This is changing now a little bit in response to some of the advocacy that's happened and consumer awareness. So some applicators are applying alternatives, but we really are working within an industry that prefers the coal tar product. So the problem with the coal tar-based sealants, they're 5% or more polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Once the application has occurred, immediately we start losing those PAHs to the environment. The most obvious loss is you smell it, right? So as it's curing, you get the volatilized PAHs, and there's an exposure pathway there. That's most impactful to the applicators and the homeowner maybe. But then over time, this stuff weathers off, ends up in our soil, tracked in on our feet and in our homes and carpeting. It ends up in our stormwater systems, which was, contaminated sediment disposal costs was something that really tipped the scales in Minnesota that led to the Minnesota ban. The stormwater systems were so contaminated with PAHs that they needed more expensive disposal facilities to get rid of this stuff. And then it also ends up in our lakes and rivers. We found that, or not we, but the researchers have found that when they start looking at sediments in the Great Lakes region for PAHs, 50 to 75% of those PAHs can be traced back to that single source. So there's a lot of sources of PAHs in our environment, and there's no way we're going to regulate all of them, but we know that this one thing is contributing, half or more of the PAH contamination in our sediments. And so, to me, it's this very kind of elegant environmental problem, if there is such a thing, because it's a product that has an alternative. It's a major contributor to pH contamination in our environment, and we don't need to be using it. It has serious environmental and human health implications, most of which are captured pretty well in that USGS fact sheet. And the only major opposition to action on this issue is coming from the industry itself, as you would suspect. It's, there are actually few notable exceptions within industry. There are manufacturers that are developing low PAH seal coats. Yes, because there's a market, but also because it's the right thing to do. And there are applicators that, the one applicator I mentioned in our initial research had made the switch to the asphalt-based seal coat long before we were aware of the issue, because he was aware of the issue. His wife became pregnant, and he's like, I'm no longer comfortable using this stuff anymore, and he made the switch himself. And so there are exceptions within industry, but in general, the pushback we get is from industry. The main human health concern is that PAHs are, or that coal tar pitch, which is, I feel like this keeps going out, coal tar pitch, which is the base ingredient in these coal tar sealants, is a class 1 carcinogen. So this is a known to cause cancer in humans. Research has found that people that live adjacent to coal tar sealed driveways have 38 times greater chance or cancer risk than those that do not. And this impacts children disproportionately because of the way they interact with the environment. They're the ones down at pavement level. They're the ones down at carpet level. They're the ones putting things in their mouths, and these are all exposure pathways. There are other human impacts, damage to embryos and fetuses, lower IQ, childhood asthma, low birth weight, heart malformations, and others that have been linked to coal tar. As far as the environmental concerns, the USGS has done the majority of research on not PAH contamination, or not the toxicity of PAHs specifically, but the PAHs in coal tar sealants. And so they've done a series of studies with runoff, with house dust, that have linked the runoff from coal tar treated surfaces to a myriad of impacts on freshwater organisms, insects, and fish. There's been research out of Oregon State University, so the USGS research has come under pretty severe scrutiny by the industry, but there is a growing body of evidence from entities that are not USGS corroborating the kind of story that USGS has arrived at through the research that they've done. There was a group at Oregon State University that actually published research that said, in fact, these are more toxic than USGS was putting forward when they looked at a broader suite of PAHs that are contained in coal tar sealants than what the USGS studies had looked at. So the evidence is becoming broader and deeper that this stuff is really impactful to both human health and our environment. There are alternatives, as I mentioned earlier. The asphalt-based seal coats have a fraction of the PAH content, like 1/1000th the PAH content. The price per gallon is similar. Manufacturers and suppliers within Michigan do stock asphalt-based supply, so the companies that make a living seal coating have access to the safer alternative. They go to the same place, they just fill up their tank with a different product. And we do have some examples of local businesses that have successfully built their business and a competitive business using the asphalt-based products. But another alternative that has shown up as we've been talking with entities, particularly those that contract seal coaters, is that not everybody believes that seal coating is actually a necessary step to increase the longevity of your pavement. So University of Michigan typically does not use seal coating as a maintenance practice, except in certain circumstances. Meyer was the other company that we found does not do seal coating. So there's groups out there that, let's say, we're just going to repave. We don't see a value in seal coating as far as money put into pavement life that we gain from it. So there's some different opinions about the value of seal coating at all. So in response, what we've seen, the first ban in the U.S. was in Austin, Texas, about 12 years ago now. And in the time, it was because of that, the connection made between seal coating and PAH contamination in their sediments, that USGS really started investigating the issue. In the 12 years since that ban has passed, they are measuring 58% less PAHs in their sediments. So this stuff does take time to move through the environment. These are persistent bioaccumulative chemicals, but they do eventually move through the system once the inputs have stopped. We've also seen Washington, Minnesota, and DC pass statewide bans, and then dozens of cities, counties, and townships throughout the U.S. are following suit. I've lost count of how many, but it's a growing number. And last calculation somebody did in 2017 was that about 22.5 million Americans are now under sealant bans, which is a fraction of our country, but it's a big and growing number. So locally, we've had 14 communities in Michigan already pass bans. It looks like Clarkston might become the next, the 15th, sometime this month. We're seeing applicators switch what they're applying. In 2016, the public health sector weighed in on this issue. The Michigan State Medical Society, which is a network of 15,000 physicians in Michigan, passed a resolution to support state-level action to prohibit the use of coal tar sealants in Michigan. We've had state legislation introduced in both the House and Senate for several years. They tend to go nowhere once they're there, but we do have legislators that are regularly bringing it up at the state level. And then we've also seen the DEQ and USGS do some sampling in our state, and the results are pending. I'm hoping that we'll see some results from that research this as early as this summer. So that's kind of the overview of the issue before we head into Q&A. But before we do that, what I like to propose to the group is a few courses of action. The ideal is to pass a local ordinance. If you reviewed the ordinance, you'll see that we are proposing regulating high PAH sealants rather than coal tar. And this gets back to that issue of these emerging alternatives that are not coal tar but are high PAH. Michigan is the first place on the map that is doing that. But all of the ordinances that have happened in Michigan do regulate PAH level to 0.1%. Milwaukee just passed a ban recently and is regulating PAH level as well. So that's the reason for that aspect of the ordinance. The other things that a municipality can do is educate your citizens. So through whatever channel you have, newsletter articles, social media, tabling events, you can talk with people about the issue so that they can make informed choices. And then you could also eliminate the use of high pH pavement sealants on township property. I don't know if that amounts to much, but it is a step that could be taken that would reduce the amount of the pollutant in the area. And then finally, encourage your state representatives to either introduce state-level legislation on this issue or sign on as a co-sponsor to legislation that is being introduced. So with that, I'll take questions.
Kirk.
Yeah, I'm just curious if, as to the reasoning behind the resistance, if the alternative is available. It sounds like it's similar cost. I'm just curious as to what the downside of, from the industry perspective, what the downside is to that alternative.
Primarily, I hear performance.
Okay.
That the coal tar is the preferred, it lasts longer on the pavement and does the job better.
Yeah, I believe that I read, or maybe somebody mentioned this to me, that the major retailers like Home Depot and Lowe's aren't carrying coal tar products anymore. Do you know, is that true?
That is true. Yeah, and we even checked that for our area at the outset. That action happened quite a while ago after the Austin ban and some of the USGS science. It was just deemed a liability, and there was no need to have the coal tar on the shelves since there was the asphalt alternative. So they were still able to supply their customers with the sealant product, but not have the liability associated with the coal tar base.
In a practical sense, homeowners who go to Home Depot, I mean, they don't even realize it, but they're using an asphalt-based sealer when
Yeah.
they do their own job, which I think makes enforcement somewhat easier maybe, that you don't have to at least worry about the homeowner, do it yourself. But let me ask you, do you know the experience of Ann Arbor or the other communities in Michigan? Have they had any, let's say, problems or issues with enforcement?
Yeah, some, but they are, resolving them the way you would any infraction. So, to your first point, it is true that folks that are doing it themselves are not using the high PAH sealants, but very few people do it themselves. It's a really nasty job. So, by and large, it is the companies they're doing the application. As far as enforcement goes, there's a couple things that communities are doing to help with enforcement. First of all, I highly recommend if you do an ordinance, you require registration. Have the companies come in at the beginning of the year, share with you what product they're going to be using. It's kind of a handshake agreement between you and the applicator company that says, I know that I'm working in a community that doesn't allow these certain products. I'm going to be applying this one, and that helps you know who's applying in your area, and if they've come through your door, they're aware of the ordinance and they've committed to complying. In the cases where the other thing that I recommend, is a pretty hefty penalty in places where there's no penalty for the infraction. It's kind of written off as the cost of doing business, or can be. There's been a couple of examples in Scioto Township. This is something that I think all communities will deal with. There are these companies that come in from out of town, so the registration really helps with your local companies, the people that do business in the township regularly and have for years. But there are companies that'll come in and try to do a really quick job and get in and out. Even in the absence of ordinances, these companies aren't always operating on the up and up. Within the industry, there's bad blood there, I guess sometimes you might characterize it as, because they'll over dilute products, or they'll charge too much, or they kind of come in and just don't really run scrupulous businesses. In the case of Scioto, it was one of these companies that came in, sold 9 or 10 households a seal coat job, said it was a safe alternative. One of the residents called and said it smells like the coal tar has a particular smell. He said, I think that I was duped here, and they came out and they did, there's a field test you can do to get a kind of first indication of whether it's a coal tar product or not, and indeed it was. And so they worked with the police department, and they're in legal proceedings now with this company. In Dexter, it was there was an incident where a company was hired to do some pavement work on a shopping mall parking lot, and just innocently started putting down the wrong stuff, maybe unaware of the ordinance, or something slipped through the cracks. And Dexter caught the process halfway through. They stopped the work. they switched to the safer alternative, and there's the companies being very cooperative with remediation of the area that was sealed with the toxic seal coat. So it's just kind of happening on an as-needed basis. In DC, they have a certain quota of field tests that they do on paved surfaces, on sealed surfaces every year. But DC has staff and resources to do that. They'll go do a field test. If they suspect it's coal tar, they'll send it to a lab, and then they'll issue an infraction if in fact it is. But one thing that they said is they've had a ordinance in place for a while now, and there's almost no infractions anymore. People get it. They've learned to comply. They, are working with the product that they're now comfortable with, and compliance is much higher than it was at the beginning. So.
You mentioned remediation. So let's say, there are a couple issues. One is, first of all, coming back to Kirk's question, I still don't understand what the motivation to use a bad product is if it's not cheaper or something. It's just performance, and it's that big a difference that people are motivated to do something that's clearly this bad anyway. And the other question is just remediation. So, let's say somebody has done that and they didn't learn about this issue, and then this year, now, their driveway has been coated with this stuff for a year, and they want to do something to minimize the mobility and the exposure of people to the PAHs. Are there strategies for example, is there a second layer of seal coat you can put down that will actually somehow immobilize the materials, for example?
Yeah, the two remediation techniques I've heard of. One is easier but less effective. The other one is pretty intense. So the kind of encapsulation, which you're talking about, like covering over it with the asphalt-based or safer sealant product, is the low-hanging fruit for remediation. In Austin, I believe it's in Austin, they require 2 layers of the asphalt base to cover the coal tar, and the bottom layer has to be colored so that they can see when you're experiencing the wear and when you have to recoat. It's imperfect because that stuff is going to wear at some point and get into your environment. But for the near term, and if you kept up on the encapsulation, that's a decent remediation technique. The other is it's removal, and it's like a sandblasting, vacuuming. It's a special piece of equipment that I've still been trying to learn whether we have one of these in Southeast Michigan. I think we probably do for some applications, but so far I haven't surfaced a company that owns this machinery. But in DC, they're required to actually remove the seal coat, and using the shot blast technique. Every day that the seal coat stays on there and is not removed, there's additional fines. So there's the high touch and the low touch, and they're both a little bit tricky. So ideally, it just doesn't get laid down in the first place.
Yeah.
As a homeowner or a neighbor, you may have said something like this, but would I know if my neighbor is putting the wrong one on or the right one? Is the odor something that I could pick up with, without a trained?
Yeah. What I've heard, I don't know firsthand, but what I've heard is that the coal tar smells like creosote, like mothballs. Mm-hmm. There's also, to the educated eye, a difference in the blackness and the sheen, but, if it's just to the lay eye, I don't think I could tell the difference. Mm-hmm. So that the smell is probably your best cue. But the other thing is, if you do registration in your community, a neighbor can call and say, hey, I saw such and such company at my neighbor's. Are they registered with the township? And if you guys have them, registered, that is at least some indication that they're probably not applying the non-compliant products.
I think I also heard you say that one of the reasons that a company might put it on is, did you say that it lasts longer?
Yes.
And if that's the case, then it would be arguable that it's cheaper to put down because you'd only have to put down every, I don't know,
2 to 3
3
every 1
years
to,
instead of-
rather than 1 to 2. Yeah.
instead of 5 or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that this is why something I'm seeing promising is industries responding by kind of innovating with their products, and so there is product development happening. The downside of it is we're getting high PAH non-coal tar sealants out there, but the upside is, hopefully they'll crack the nut and they'll get a high performance, low PAH sealant in the future here, and we'll all win. In the meantime, there's these trade-offs associated with the different products. From the folks that I know that are applying the asphalt-based, they feel comfortable with the product that they're selling homeowners and feel like with appropriate application technique and weather conditions that they get high performance out of the asphalt-based. But that's not an opinion shared, throughout the industry. So there's some just like, this is what we've always done. This is what we know how to do and do well, and this is what we want to sell you because it's the product we believe in. So, some of it's habit, some of it is probably performance. The other thing I've heard is, you think about low flush toilets. When those things first came online, it was just a bad idea to install them. And then they got better and better and better. And even though, but the stigma maybe of those initial ones took some time to kind of undo in the general public knowledge. And so people shied away from these, even though they were high performing eventually because, innovation, allowed us better performing low flow toilets, right? So I feel like something similar is happening in that industry where the asphalt-based products are getting better, maybe not as good as the coal tar, but it may not be conventional wisdom at this point.
What is the model ordinance that's in our packet? What's the source? I mean, who developed that?
It came to us originally from, we looked at Austin's and we looked at Minnesota's, and then we modified it for PAH level as this emerging alternatives issue showed up.
So you are the source then?
The Watershed Council drafted the ordinance. Mm-hmm.
A second question on that. It seems the model ordinance seems pretty straightforward, but I was a little surprised that there's an annual registration, right? And I was thinking, why wouldn't you just have them register once? And then it seems less cumbersome to just do it initially. And then obviously if you're going to be new, then you would have to register.
Yeah, I think it's a point of communication between the township and the company. These companies, some of them have been in business for decades, but a lot of them come and go pretty quickly. And it gives you an opportunity to stay connected to the community by doing it annually, and just making sure that if leadership changes or ownership or anything, that people are still aware that what they should be putting in their trucks.
So the very first recognized chemically induced cancer was from PAHs, and I was curious about the workers. Is there a significant recognition of, presumably they're exposed a lot, and is there enough history and evaluation of their lives to know that their exposures have led to increases in actual cancer?
No, I haven't seen anything making that connection. In fact, that's one of the legs the industry stands on pretty strong, is that there's not been that tie between the applicators and the cancers. But it is very difficult to connect a cancer to a source of that cancer. However, the anecdotal information that I hear is not about the cancer, but just about kind of the noxiousness of the product to work with: skin burns, eye burning, nose issues, that kind of thing. And so, I share the anecdote about the applicator in Dexter switching because his wife got pregnant, and he kind of understood I just wanted to avoid the exposure for her. Another anecdote I can share is that as these ordinances started to pass and companies were switching, applicators were excited to switch who they worked for to those that were applying the asphalt-based seal coat. I don't know how often that happened or to what degree, but I think there is, for the people working in the field actually standing over this stuff, I think they feel it.
Well, it had the number in here, a factor of 38 is an enormous number, and, I would think that the people who are actually working with it on a regular basis would be, that much more at risk, presumably. And so it ought to stand out if there was any, numerical data available. That's what I was just curious about, yeah. So the other question along those lines is, that's a big number, to what extent is my neighbor liable if I get cancer?
Oh.
If he's applied this, every 2 years for the last 10 years or whatever,
Yeah, that's outside of what I can comment on, but
Yeah.
it is unfortunate how ubiquitous this stuff is. I grew up next
cigarette,
to a
there actually was, successful legal responsibility ascribed to cigarette smoking eventually. Took 50 or 60 years.
Actually, coal tar is produced in producing town gas. So there are coal tar contaminated sites all over. I mean, there's one in Grand Rapids and Grand Ledge. That's why when you said the smell, because I was out there when they actually did some of the borings. It does smell like mothballs. Yeah, I mean, it's just because. Now, are there any other communities in the area that have passed an ordinance like this, or that we'd kind of be on the backs of, or?
Well, so of the 14 communities, 13 of them are in Southeast Michigan. I did talk to East Lansing's Environmental Commission last year. They have not taken action to this point, but it would be great if both communities would do that. I think that's actually helpful to the applicator community as well to have, if they can only put one type of seal coat in their tank, so if they can empty that tank in an area, that's helpful. Close by here, so they're Wolverine Lake, Hamburg, West Bloomfield, Grosse Ile, and then all sorts of Pinckney, Dexter, Scioto Township, Ann Arbor Township, Van Buren Township, Ypsilanti. So there's quite a few in this part, southern lower Michigan, but not right up here. You guys would be the first.
I have a question.
Peter.
So, my question's more about kind of the process by which we adopt a code. Have you ran into any communities that started down the path of regulating the sealants and for some reason ran into some kind of opposition? Like, is there things that we need to be aware of or some kind of guidance in that realm?
When we first started advocating for ordinances, the Pavement Coatings Technology Council would show up and share their side of the story. But in all cases, the communities proceeded to pass the ordinances anyway. In some of those early meetings, some of the applicator community came, but again, there was not a large outcry, and the communities proceeded.
You talked about fines being the leverage. I guess I'm curious, are there any cases where an ordinance called for a fine to be levied against the purchaser, the homeowner?
I believe the language in the ordinance allows for either, but there's not been a homeowner penalized, to my knowledge. It's, more to be an disincentive for the companies. In the cases that we've had where homeowners had the coal tar applied, it was without them knowing. So, yeah. I think you would, there might be a sliding scale. Like maybe if a homeowner was non-compliant intentionally, that might be a different fee than a company that may have done it repeatedly, just depending on the nature of the infraction.
I'm trying to remember the name of it. Down on Jolly Road, it's connected to MSU, but there's the Institute for Pavement Protection or something like that.
There is a paper, yeah.
Yeah. And they actually had probably the foremost green chemist in the country come in because his company has a new product this is more for regular asphalt, but I was just thinking they could be allies in this. They're more focused on plain old roadways, I think, but they may have some expertise in this area and some perspective to offer.
They're in my department.
Okay.
Right,
It's the pavement preservation.
pavement preservation, okay. Huh.
So I know you mentioned that there's been legislation introduced state level to prohibit this in sealants, but is there separate from the sealant application, is there a maximum allowable level of PAHs as a state level law, or is it an unregulated compound or contaminant?
So this is what I believe DEQ is working on, specifically around stormwater sediments. I think there's a whole nother body of kind of thresholds and such for these brownfield or Superfund sites where it's an old gas plant that has really high concentrations of PAHs from coal tar. My understanding is that there is not required testing for PAHs in stormwater sediments currently. And so I don't want to speak outside of what I know well, but so let me follow up on that with you after. But I believe that there is a difference between the regulations and standards in Michigan than there were in Minnesota that enabled Minnesota to look at this as an economic problem. So we don't have that lever here, which means that there's something missing in at state level regulation that we don't have that more expensive disposal aspect of this problem at this point. But the DEQ has done some sampling throughout Michigan to kind of understand the problem here and start addressing that gap.
I was trying to look up for the land application, because I'm sure there is a standard, for land application of PAHs. I don't know what it was. I can't get, what? It's actually my guess, and don't quote me on this, but my guess it's actually lower than the percent that's in this product.
Well, if it's 5 to 10%, yeah, I would hope so.
It's significantly lower.
Yeah, and so the Milwaukee study that led to that ban, it's most concentrated at the point of application, and then it dilutes as it moves through the environment, right? So when they were looking at river sediments in Milwaukee, they were still finding that even with all that dilution factor, that pHs in riverbed sediments were coming out at levels exceeding the probable effects concentrations. So that concentration above which you'd expect to see impact to aquatic organisms. So, it is occurring enough and concentrating enough in the environment that it's exceeding these these thresholds. So what my understanding is, but what we would have to confirm is that there's a level of PAH contamination in stormwater sediments that you have to kind of elevate which type of disposal facility it goes to. But it's not part of the required testing, the toxics that need to be tested for as a standard. And so you can't knowingly dispose of highly contaminated sediments, but you're also not required to look at that one specifically. And so you can unknowingly dispose of them. So that's my understanding, and that's why it's just kind of a gap in the regulation. So we'd have to confirm that that's the case, but that's my understanding of where we're kind of falling through the cracks with the sediment disposal regs.
So Peter, I have a question for you. If someone is doing construction that could raise silt and things like that, they're required to both get permits and, put up silt fences and so forth, do an analysis of what possible dispersal of silt and whatever runoff could happen. But do we have any permitting process for something like a repaving or a resurfacing like this? Is there, if you're gonna put something up on the side of your house, you have to get a permit practically, so I'm just
Short
curious.
answer is no. So residential driveways or even a property like Hobby Lobby wants to redo their commercial parking lot, no, we don't have anything. So unless they're tearing up pavement or doing some sort of work to the parking lot itself, if they're gonna resurface it, I don't even think we have something for resurfacing the parking lot. So yeah, that's definitely a gap in our regulations.
This seems like a thing that could be of significantly greater risk than a little bit of, sediment or silt, running off because the shape of the land has changed temporarily.
In early discussions with communities about how to implement this, the permitting came up, but what we heard back was that's a pretty significant administrative burden, especially if you're going to do it on every household driveway. And that's when the registration alternative came up is, still a point of contact, but less of an administrative burden than permitting every seal coat application. So it's fewer people to talk to.
Permitting has to do with impacts on your neighbors too, right? Permitting is about, setbacks and things like that. To me, the way you've described this, if it's putting your neighbors and their babies at risk, people might desire that level of administrative control. I don't know, I'm just curious. So there's no place that's approached it that way?
Not that I'm aware of, but
Okay.
there's a lot of places that, I haven't seen their ordinance or how they're implementing it.
Interesting, okay.
There's another question for Peter. This may be premature, though. Did you get a chance to look at the model ordinance? And if you did, is there anything that you saw there that was, from the planning department's perspective, problematic?
I did read through it. I didn't notice anything problematic.
Okay.
Yet again, I'm new. I'm just
Okay.
learning this today, so I'm assuming that they've done the model ordinance is
Yeah.
tip top.
Would it make sense to you that, it seems like the next logical step is to get everybody on the Environmental Commission and the Planning Department an opportunity to review the model ordinance to see if there's any questions or concerns? Or is there something else we should be doing as the next step?
I'll answer that to start, and Rebecca can supplement. It seems like that's a prudent course of action. We could review, come back to what we've talked about today, maybe let it sink in our next meeting, and review the model ordinance in detail, and decide if this is something that the Environmental Commission wants to, pass a motion to initiate or encourage the Planning Commission and the board to initiate some kind of code amendment to move this. I would imagine it'd be a non-zoning amendment, so we would probably go right to the township board with it.
Peter, I'll tell you that I'm gonna take this to the commission, the planning commission. I will raise the issue. I'm sorry. Anyway, this is definitely an issue I'll raise with the commission. If it's initiated here, that would be fine. If not, I will be recommending that the commission initiate something. So.
Well, too, I think, a compelling case is made for a township ban, and, you know, I was talking to a friend about this, and she actually knew of the issue, and she said, oh, yeah, you know, I called up a number of sealers, and I asked them if they would be willing to do this, and they said, no, this is the, you know, we basically use the coal tar product, and if you don't, you know, that's just what we do. And I think this is a good example of even, you know, conscientious citizens by themselves can't change the marketplace because they're one person and businesses are used to doing businesses a certain way. If you have an entire township make a policy, then there's at least a few businesses that'll see it as an opportunity to switch their practices.
Yeah, and that's also why I, you know, said nudge your neighbors too, because I do feel like that, you know, the more area within reach of that company that does have the ordinance, the easier it actually makes it on them to you know, do business in your, you know, in a township that does have an ordinance. So, yeah.
Are you gonna wrap up with?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about, do we feel as though we understand this issue enough to express an opinion about it now? I guess I want to ask the,
I would suggest we come back to it. I know Rebecca's got a long drive back, so we could probably thank her for coming, and we
Right.
can talk amongst ourselves if that's what
Right.
next action we
Okay.
want to pursue on it.
because I have to get out of here too. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Rebecca. This is really, really an interesting discussion. It reminds me of the asbestos story, of course. And so these things are very hard problems.
Yeah.
Asbestos, lead.
Yeah,
And
lead, right, right.
Part of it is the way we look at materials that we use. Actually, coal tar used to, in the 20s, when town gas, they were actually marketing coal tar production sites as sanitariums for people with respiratory ailments.
Well, right, they also marketed cigarettes as things that
Yeah, it's
somehow
bizarre, I know.
did
Oh,
good
and the
things for
one
your
link that I have heard between the cancers and the coal tar were chimney sweeps. They were, you know, exposed to.
Yeah, that's the original PAH. Yeah, that's the story I tell in every organic chemistry class.
Right.
Personal
yeah,
pots.
and you know, I mean, lead pipes made really good pipes, but they weren't good for
us.
us, you know, and that's what, with this coal tar, it might make a great pavement sealant, but it's a terrible, you know, product to have in our homes and near our water, so we can do better.
All right, any other questions? Thank you very much, and thanks for coming all the way to tell us this story.
Sure, no problem. And let me know if you have follow-up questions. I'm happy to work with you guys through this. The ordinance has, each time it's been reviewed by a community, it's gone through legal review, so it has had some substantial vetting. And you guys will do your own, but if you have any questions about that, let me know. We're happy to help however we can. All right,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.